The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor in lovely Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, it's been a very eventful week in our space. We've had our newsletter just jam-packed. Last week, obviously, there was all the events related to the G7 summit and all that came out of that. Then this week, we've been moving up into this very important visit by Congolese President Félix Tshisekedi to Beijing. He is spending 4 days in China. He's going to be in Beijing, and then later he's going to go to Shanghai, and then he's going to end up in Shenzhen before returning home. High on his agenda, in fact, probably top of the agenda, is going to be restructuring two of these very big mining deals. One for the Tenke-Fungurume mine that they have, which is between Gécamines, which is the state-owned mining company, and China Moly, CMOC for short. That is a big cobalt mine. And then also the Gécamines deal. Remember, that was the deal of the century, $6 billion deal. Back then, it was a huge thing. And it was one of the first major deals in the China-Africa relationship. But what it said was these deals are highly, highly unfair, favoring the Chinese side, and Tshisekedi's going to restructure the deals. But it's very interesting, Cobus, because it's not entirely clear that he's going to be successful, in part because the Chinese may have the upper hand in the negotiations, given the fact that elections for the presidency are going to happen on December 20th. And so it's very, very interesting to watch how these critical resources deals are playing out, the politics behind them. Tshisekedi's visit is a very important trip.
Absolutely. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see whether he can pull off a deal. Of course, for him, it'll be a big electoral win if he can. But then, it'll also be interesting to see what the contours of the new deal is, particularly because the Congo is very interested in trying to move up the value chain, including, locating refining and possibly even battery making there. But it's a big ask, kind of among others, because the country has very weak infrastructure, and that would mean whichever company commits to that deal would then also have to commit to putting in electricity infrastructure and other kind of non-related kind of necessary facilities. So it'll be very interesting to see how that shakes out.
And just a quick programming note, in our Africa show that comes out on Friday, or the following podcast after this one, for those of you listening later on, we're going to be speaking with our colleague Geronima, who is the Francophone editor for the China Global South Project. He's one of the top China-Africa mining experts and Congolese himself, and he's been all over the media and following this trip very closely. So tune in to that show. But Cobus, you bring up a very interesting point about moving up the value chain. That has been a priority not only for the Congo, but for countries throughout the Global South, particularly those that have lithium, graphite, chrome, any of these battery metals that are essential to power electric vehicles. One country that has done this more effectively than anyone else and is ahead of the game is Indonesia. And for those of you not familiar with the battery metal landscape, Indonesia in many respects is the Congo of Southeast Asia. And that is, so Congo has about 60 to 70% of the known reserves for cobalt. Indonesia has a similarly disproportionate impact in the nickel market. And so it has been a powerhouse in nickel and battery metals. In fact, it's attracted billions of dollars of Chinese mining investment. In fact, many of the same companies like Zhejiang Cobalt, China Moly, and others who are active in the DRC are also active in Indonesia. So we thought today it would be fascinating to talk about the politics of mining, the environment, and the politics of China-Indonesia relations. And for that, we are thrilled to have on the show for the first time our brand new colleague, Antonia Timmerman, who is our new Southeast Asia editor based in Jakarta. A very good evening to you, Antonia.
Good evening, Eric.
It's great to have you on the show. It's great to have you part of the team. Welcome to China Global South. What we'd like to do is start first on this nickel issue. When you did some reporting, some excellent reporting for Rest of World, which is a great tech site, you can find them online. You did a really in-depth report on the nickel mining business, again, talking about the Chinese role in this space. Let's talk a little bit about what lessons do you think Indonesia has learned since they've started this process of moving up the value chain? What do you think the lessons and the takeaway are from the nickel experience that countries like the DRC and some of the lithium producing countries might want to follow?
What the lessons are, well, I just think it's important that we pay attention to what is happening in the electric vehicles supply chain. Because for all the talk about how it's going to be a green transportation, I think the lesson here is we should also care about how we're making these products and who are sacrificing for these products to be made. I mean, in the end, we know that mining is always a dirty business, whether it's China or Japan or whoever else is doing it. But, if profits are concentrated to very few people while the costs are burdened to the public, then the way it's developed could be very wrong. So I guess the lesson, there might be some soul searching to do here. And especially if we talk about the electric vehicles industry.
So one of the tools that Indonesia has used to force people to refine locally is export bans on raw mineral ore. And we're seeing African countries increasingly starting to move in that same direction. I think Zimbabwe is a key example with lithium. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the kind of impact has been of these export bans. And, because as I understand it, it also caused some fights for Indonesia with other great powers around the world.
So we have placed an export ban, I think it was around 2014. And the impact of that was very direct into the involvement of China coming into the nickel processing part of the chain. So because of the ban, they couldn't export the ores directly, right? So what they did is they invested heavily in smelters. So that is more expensive, but that gives them more value because they can just now export the processed nickel.
It's interesting because you talked about earlier how we should be thinking about the impact of who makes these metals and what goes into the cars and the effects that that's having on the communities where these resources come from. What we have right now is that the mining comes from one place, the extraction of a metal comes from one place, say the lithium triangle in South America, or cobalt from the DRC, or nickel from Indonesia. And then in many instances, it's processed somewhere else. So in many cases, China. So the concentration of pollution and environmental impact is spread out a little bit. Now in a case like Indonesia, where the mining of the nickel is taking place there, as well as the processing, it seems that those are two environmentally impactful events that are happening. And in your reporting, when you went to the nickel mining zones, did you get a sense that the Chinese mining companies or the other foreign mining companies and the Indonesian laws were up to the task of protecting the communities and the people and the environment from the double impact of mining and processing?
I would say definitely not up to the task yet. We spent 10 days in 2 islands in Maluku and Sulawesi to see the nickel processing facilities there. And in these 2 islands, they have 2 of the largest industrial parks, Weda Bay Industrial Park and Morowali Industrial Park. And both are mostly owned by Tsingshan Group, which is a Chinese steel company. So I went there with a photographer and met with the local guides there. And it was just devastating. We met with dozens of residents and they're all very angry and very frustrated that there is just so much destruction happening to their land. And we saw that these nickel facilities have been built right on top of their villages. And there was very little to no warning and no discussion with the local residents. So imagine you suddenly wake up and open the house door and see all these heavy equipments and them being like, oh, sorry, we're just building this whole belt on top of your head and it's going to be permanent. And the industrial areas are so huge that it's literally devouring several villages. And it affects everything. It affects the waters, the forests, and people live off of that, right? They're farmers and they're fishermen. So now they cannot fish and they cannot farm and they cannot perform their traditional rituals because a lot of things that they make for the rituals come from the forest. So now not only they cannot eat, but they're also losing their culture and their identity. So it's very sad to witness that. And there is very little thing that the government or the company is doing about that.
So where is the blame? Who's responsible here? Are they angry with Chingsan and the mining companies, or are they angry with the government, or both?
Well, for the average Indonesian, most of the time, they don't know who these companies are. They don't know whether it's the Chinese or the French or whoever. I think for the average Indonesian, when it comes to environmental protection, when we see something that is suddenly destroying our land, of course, the first place we'll go to is our own local government because we put them there in place because we expect them to act in our best interest. So when I go there, most of them, they are very angry at the Indonesian government for not enforcing the environmental laws. For the few that know that, okay, it's a Chinese company, they are angry at the Chinese company, I think, but they still expect the Indonesian government to enforce their own local laws.
And is the Indonesian government getting the kind of development and profit kind of outputs that they were hoping for from these investments?
Actually, there's this data that I just pulled yesterday. Apparently, last year, over $11 billion were invested in processing minerals, and the majority of this number was for nickel. And from that investment, we exported over $34 billion worth of processed nickel. So it's very lucrative business, right? It's a lot of money. But in the simplest sense, profits that the government is talking about is definitely not the government who is gaining the most advantage. It's China and the local partners who gain the most from that number of export. There's one analyst I talked to the other day, and he has the numbers. So he said our state-owned enterprises only control 5% of the nickel production. And the rest belongs to China and the local partners and the other foreign companies. And China controls 61% in that part of the chain. And, add to that the fact that right now nickel products can be directly exported with very little tax obligations. So we are losing out. And if you put it in the context of EV development, right, I think we lose out even more because Indonesia doesn't have the technology yet to build the batteries and the vehicles. So the nickel products, after they are smelted, after they're processed, they have to go outside, and it's mostly to China, who absorbs most of our nickel products, and then get processed further there, get built into batteries or components or whatever, and then be sold back to Indonesia's much higher price. So we lose out even more.
So, Cobus, when you listen to this must be absolutely depressing for you as an African, because the conversation in Africa that has been going on for years is that if only we move up the value chain, everything will be better. More money will be here, more profits will be here. But if the Indonesian example says anything to us, it shows that even if you're processing domestically, that the profits are privatized, the costs are socialized. And there's no guarantee that just because you process and you move up the value chain as a country, that the benefits go to the people.
Yes.
And it doesn't look like that's happening.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's very depressing, and it raises kind of larger questions about whether it's possible to mine oneself into development. Kind of if one happens to be a country with minerals, like the Democratic Republic of Congo or like South Africa, actually, whether it's possible to actually use mining to bridge into development and what that would actually mean. I think it's very much not, I think Indonesia shows that it's very much not a clear-cut path. Kind of it's certainly not a one-to-one situation where if you manage to kind of claw kind of additional parts of the value chain into your country, which for many African countries still remains a far-off goal, whether that would even help. Kind of I don't think that's clear-cut. Antonia, I was wondering, with the fact that actually, it's not making as much money as they were hoping, and that it's really bad for these communities and for the environment, is that making the current government less popular? And do you foresee, kind of that these kind of political pressures coming from the provinces back into Jakarta to cause political problems for the current government?
So I think the political problems for the current government when it comes to China is definitely far beyond this nickel issue. I mean, Indonesia's relationship in China in general has always been complicated. And when we talk about Jokowi's relationship with China, also, I think first we have to understand that there are very complex cultural and ideological legacies that Jokowi inherited when he became president. And when it comes to China, or when it comes to having any relationship with any communist party or a communist country in the world, it's always been complex for countries like Indonesia. We have always been a non-bloc country. Our first president, Sukarno, was very clear to not take any side, whether the Western or Eastern Bloc, and we also even had that Africa-Asia conference in Bandung in the 50s, where we declared not to take any side. So that's ideological. And then there's the history as well, the genocide that happened in the 60s, if you're familiar with it. It's a little bit of history, but I promise it's relevant. So basically in the 60s, there was a staged coup against Sukarno, our first president. And the Indonesian military, who was kind of swayed by the CIA at the time, put the blame on the communists. So we had a large communist party at the time, Partai Komunis Indonesia, which was the largest political party in the country. And they were blamed for the alleged coup attempt. And so people were mobilized to find and murder anyone who was a communist. And almost 1 million people were killed for being communists. So as you can see, that's a very big trauma already, and that's a very big stigma. If you're a communist, that means you are dangerous and you want to put this country in danger. So the problem with the government right now having a relationship with China, I think that goes far beyond the nickel issue.
Well, let's turn now to the broader relationship. And one of the focal points in the China-Indonesia relationship is the building of I think it's $9 billion high-speed railway between two of the largest urban centers in the country, Bandung, which you mentioned, which is famous for the Africa-Asia Summit and the non-aligned movement, and the capital of Jakarta. You wrote about this for your weekly column on our site. It was your first column for us. It was fascinating to get a deep insight into the politics of it and how Joko Widodo, the president, is playing politics with who he partners with for infrastructure development. So let's talk a little bit about the high-speed railway. It's going to be opening next month. First of all, are you looking forward to this? Do you think it was worth all of the time, the money, the environmental impact that it had in order to be able to travel really fast between Bandung and Jakarta?
Short answer, no. We had many other transportation options from Jakarta and Bandung and vice versa. We have the highway, we have the regular train with very pleasant ride, with good views and comfortable seats. And also people don't fly from Jakarta to Bandung since it will be a very short flight. So there are no long flights that will be replaced by this high-speed train. So I don't want to be harsh and call it a vanity project, but if you look at the circumstances of how this project was fast-tracked after Jokowi's election, it's really hard not to think of it as that. And Yeah, that's why in my article, I wanted to take us back to that time leading to Jokowi's win and the time after he finally won the presidency. Because I describe it as a euphoric moment, really, where everybody believes that finally, our time has come. And finally, this time we will be a developed country. And developed countries have bullet trains. It's just a symbol of good and highly developed infrastructure. So this is where the projects come from.
And you mentioned also that the bid process was very controversial, particularly because of competing Chinese and Japanese bids for the same project. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about all of these issues around the bidding.
Yeah, sure. So there are a number of reasons that the government officially explained, and a number of others that the government never really said out loud. So the official reasons why we chose China over Japan was simply because, first of all, China was cheaper. So in the negotiations, it was decided that it would be a B2B project rather than G2G. So in theory, it means Indonesia would not have to use the state budget to fund and guarantee the project. And also the proposed total cost from China was lower than Japan's. And there was also a promise for technology transfer. Meanwhile, Japan's total cost in their proposal at the time was higher, and it was a G2G deal, so Japan wanted Indonesia to use the state budget. So the financing proposal from Japan was really a deal breaker for the Indonesian government. That was clear, and that was explained and everything. Now, the other reason was picking China over Japan was also about building leverage. Something like two birds with one stone, right? And Jokowi loves doing projects where he feels like he can gain two or three things at once. So like I mentioned in my article, Jokowi had other ambitions beyond the railway. And not only his other projects are expensive, they also require a lot of bargaining power. One example was the deal with Freeport, which is the largest gold mining company in Indonesia that is owned by an American company. And they have been operating in Indonesia for 50 years. And Jokowi at the time, his goal was to take over 51% of Freeport. And dealing with the US for this was not easy, but it turned out to be a successful deal. So some of the analysts that I'm talking to today, when they look back, they said, this could be because of this leverage that Jokowi had built using China. But well, now we know that could only work for so long and so far, right? Because the high-speed rail deal itself turned out not to be a really good deal. We ended up using the state budget anyways, and the total cost for that railway ended up being higher than Japan's proposal. And that is the irony that even the Indonesian government is admitting today, quietly.
It's an interesting discussion about what's going on in Indonesia with this railway, because we're in this moment now where the United States is now starting to ramp up its spending on development to compete with the Belt and Road, with its PGII initiative. There's the Global Gateway initiative coming from the Europeans. The Japanese are out there with lots of infrastructure building here in Southeast Asia. So our subway here in Ho Chi Minh City, 12 years after they began, is still being built. I don't know when it's ever going to be finished. That's all a Japanese project here. But what some of the analysts were telling you about the difficulties of dealing with the US, the Europeans, and the Japanese and their higher standards for environment and for labor and for good governance and for transparency and all these things, compared to dealing with the Chinese, which is much easier because they're not as strict on those at all. And this is what we hear in other parts of the world. So those frustrations you talked about with Freeport also seem to carry over into this infrastructure space as well. What are the analysts telling you about that and how that played a part of the decision whether to go with the Chinese or the Japanese?
Right. It's true that it seems to be the general view among the analysts that I talked to that one of the larger reasons that Indonesia prefers to work with Chinese is there's less sustainability requirements or demands that the government must meet before a project is approved. So that means less cost for the government when they're doing deals with China. But also, one thing that I notice is that the Indonesian government likes to portray this in the media as being more about economic sovereignty. And that is also the case with Freeport, right? And other mining sites that he took over from other foreign companies. It's all about sovereignty. The lingo that they often use is always along the line of, don't dictate us, don't tell us what to do. The Chinese never tell us what to do. So for the government, it's about sovereignty and about national pride, or at least that they want to make it look that way. That's the image that they need to maintain.
And, in that context, do you get the feeling that the government is aligning itself more fully with China? Or is it also trying to, as you mentioned, it has a long history of non-alignment. So is it using these relationships with China to also get some kind of something out of China's opponents, like the United States or so? Like what is it? How is this relationship with the United States shifting, and what is it trying to achieve in that relationship?
So I think Jokowi is an opportunistic leader at the core of his administration. That is just how he operates. So if he seems to be closer to China right now, that's because he gets more from that side, or he thinks that he gets more from that side, rather than it being an ideological statement or something that is for long-term or permanent. Like, nothing is forever here. It's just that, whoever can give the best deal for whatever strategic projects that the government wants to achieve. And talking about the United States, the relationship with United States right now, today, I think the Indonesian government is very frustrated, and the government is not sure what the US can offer Indonesia right now. They tried many times with the US for their strategic projects. They tried to get Tesla to open a factory in Indonesia, and that failed. They are looking for investors for the new capital city, which is another mega project from Jokowi. And as far as I know, there has been no meaningful commitment from American investors. And the last one, the most recent one, is the funding for energy transition, which also there's no money coming. So I would imagine it must be very frustrating for the government right now.
Yeah, and Jokowi seems to be playing the same game that everybody here in Southeast Asia does, where you don't have the luxury of really taking a side. So most countries in the region are very skillfully playing the great powers off each other and using the Chinese, the Japanese, the Indians, and the Americans as part of a bigger game. And I see Jokowi doing that, and what you've been explaining, very much a part of that. Very quickly before we go, I just want to end on a quote that Jokowi said at the G7 summit. So Indonesia was an observer at the G7 summit in Hiroshima last week, and he said, developing countries, and this is a direct quote, developing countries are becoming doubtful over the funding commitments by developed nations. And to say something like that right in front of the world's wealthiest democracies is quite a bold statement. And it's got me thinking in the context, because it sounds like he's virtue signaling in some respects on behalf of developing countries. But then when we turn around and see the fact that his own government is not implementing environmental protections in Indonesia, in the mining sector, for example, it seems a little bit disingenuous. Tell me a little bit about how you interpret that quote from President Jokowi.
Yeah, so I spoke to my contact who was attending the G7, and he works for an Indonesian environmental NGO, and he was there to observe. First of all, there's indeed no money coming, and it's very disappointing. But at the same time, the analyst also said that our proposal is perhaps not convincing enough. Apparently, there's some regular projects that are being lumped into the climate proposal. So these projects are sort of greenwashed into looking like they are green projects when they are in fact not. And they get bundled into this one proposal with the other real green project. I don't know enough details about which projects he was talking about, or if the amount is significant enough. But yes, the climate funding is really important for countries like Indonesia. And so Jokowi's statement was to voice that frustration that it's really hard to get money from these rich countries because of the very high standards that the government has to satisfy. Meanwhile, it's easier to get commitment from China As you know, the government is building a green industrial park in Kalimantan, which is where the new capital city would be. And China has been an eager investor again. So although if we're talking about the green park, yes, there are questions about whether the park is truly green. That's for sure, because I heard that some smelters will still use coal for power. And so this is why nobody besides China will be willing to give money for it. So that shows that it's true that Indonesia cannot just, suddenly raise the standards and kill the coal industry in one night, overnight, without the funding. And it shows the level on which the Indonesian government can operate at the moment and what kind of support it needs if the Western countries really want to uphold their standards.
Well, I'm glad that the president is saying this. I mean, Indonesia is not just any developing country. It's the world's largest Muslim majority country. It's also one of the world's largest countries, and certainly one of the largest here in Asia, where there are a lot of big countries. And so it's got power through its size and through its credibility and its history to be able to articulate some of these things. So I hope that he keeps that up. And it's been absolutely fascinating to get your insights on all these stories. Antonia, thank you so much for taking the time and for staying up late for us. Again, welcome to the team. We're looking forward to your columns. We're looking forward to your reporting. You're also going to be coordinating coverage for us with contributors throughout Southeast Asia. And by the way, if you are a journalist, if you are a nonprofit activist, if you are an analyst, if you are anybody in the sustainability, green, environmental, climate change space here in Southeast Asia and would like to contribute, and we are actually paying for this. So we have paid contributors now throughout the region. We'll put a link to it in the show notes for how you can get in touch with Antonia and submit a part of our call for contributions, because we have some great reporting opportunities for contributors throughout the region for the next couple of years in Southeast Asia to focus on the China-Southeast Asia relationship related to climate and environment. Antonia, if people want to follow you on Twitter and keep in touch with all that you're doing, where can they find you?
On Twitter, my handle is at Timmerman, TIMMERMAN91.
Okay. Well, we'll put a link to that in the show notes. Also, we'll put a link to Antonia's fantastic report from Rest of World on the nickel industry and mining sector in Indonesia. So there's a lot in the show notes from Antonia. Antonia, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Cobus, we don't talk about what happens here in Southeast Asia very much. We certainly don't talk a lot about what's happening in Indonesia. That's now going to change now that Antonia is part of our team. And the fact that there's now two of us in Southeast Asia is really going to be wonderful to be able to talk about all of the experiences that these countries here have had in so many of the same sectors that we're talking about issues in Africa, the Middle East, and in the Americas as well, related to mining, the Chinese, and everything else like that. I got to be honest with you, I'm taken aback a little bit by what I heard from Antonia today. Because all we've heard about is the hype about we have to start processing more. We have to bring more value, move up the value chain. You hear the Americans talking about that endlessly when they talk about the Congo and we want to help the Congo move up the value chain. It doesn't appear that there is a precedent right now in the developing world for getting away from the resource curse. And moving up the value chain doesn't seem to be the answer to that problem. The other thing I want to get your take on is what I heard from Antonia reminded me a lot about the conversations and the discourse that's been going on about Kenyan economist David Ndii, who has said that the investment in railway and these massive infrastructure projects and the loans that come with it, particularly from the Chinese, are not worth it. The money could have been spent better elsewhere. What was your reaction to some of those themes that Antonia brought up?
In relation to the rail, I agree, but I agree with some reservations, because I wonder if the lesson to take is whether, high-speed rail itself is a money pit, which, I think there is the argument to be made in that direction, or whether the issue is, like beware the perils of a very high profile, politically loaded, like national kind of prestige project that will then inevitably get loaded with padded costs by local actors and by Chinese actors. Because that, I think, is the case in both the standard gauge railway in Kenya and in the high-speed rail between Jakarta and Bandung. So I did some research into that case about a year and a half ago for SIA. And, we were comparing that. It was part of a larger project that was comparing Southeast Asian and African infrastructure outcomes around environmental issues particularly. And one of the big issues that was interesting, that was overlapping with those two projects, was the role of local actors in padding land acquisition costs, for example, which they not only pushed, in both cases helped to kind of push it over budget, but also held back the process for a long time. So, I think the kind of issues that, or the actors that kind of get activated or that become active in these kind of high status national prestige rail projects, those kind of dynamics and political and corruption dynamics around those projects are their own set of problems, and then the question becomes like whether it's then possible to implement high-speed rail in a way that doesn't trigger all these problems.
It's funny you say that, because that is the conversation that we in California have been having for more than a decade in trying to build a high-speed railway there. So this is not a problem unique to the Global South, certainly not a problem unique to Indonesia. And this question of going over budget and the subsidies, listen, the Chinese are the last people to ever hear any lectures on this, because they subsidize their railway just with ridiculous sums of money. Pretty much everybody except Japan subsidizes their railway to massive, massive amounts of money. Okay, so I'm not entirely sure that these projects are meant to be profitable. They're meant to provide a baseline for economic activity. But then again, David N.D. in Kenya, I think, does have a point, is could $9 billion, or however much it costs in Indonesia to build this railway, been better allocated for other uses? I don't know. But that is an academic question, but one that's very interesting to consider. I'm surprised that people aren't more excited in Indonesia about this new railway. And it's just neat to have that kind of infrastructure. But I guess maybe when you've been building it for as long as they have, when it's had as much controversy as much as it's had, it's a little bit like the Ho Chi Minh City subway that I was talking about. Whenever this thing eventually gets built, people can be like, yeah, whatever. Just let's get it over with. I'm done and over with it. Which is why I come back to the PGII and to the Global Gateway. And I've said this a number of times on the show. Building infrastructure in the developing world is frickin' hard. And I think when the Americans come out so bold and start talking a big game on this, they got to be careful, because they're going to set expectations high. And you can see how difficult it is in places like Vietnam and Indonesia.
Absolutely. It's never easy. If you do it in a way, if you do it right, in the way that I guess Japan being the greatest example, then it doesn't even matter whether the rail network itself is profitable, because of the kind of knock-on development effects that it has. In Japan, it's been massively successful, and just in boosting kind of national development by unlocking all of these commercial opportunities around, for example, the commercial rights around the floors above stations, for example, and so on. So, so it pulled in a lot of people, and in the process became a kind of a larger engine of development. But, as you say, it's tough to do anywhere. And and then in the case of the United States, if they haven't even really done it domestically, how are they going to do it in other countries? I just don't understand that.
Well, they issued a fact sheet that listed all of their different initiatives under PGII. I forget, what is PGII again? I can't keep up with their...
Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment.
Partnership, that was the P. Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment. Okay, so they listed all the things. There are a lot of MOUs in there. And there are a lot of we're starting a feasibility study. So you got to look through... read between the lines on what they're saying. There's not a lot of money that's been committed. Also, the size of the projects they're doing are in the millions, tens of millions, a couple hundreds of millions, nothing in the billions, really. And I just wonder if those efforts, while they're important, and the infrastructure deficit in Africa and the Americas is enormous, where most of these projects are located, I just wonder if a couple $100 million here for a project, a couple $100 million there for a project is really going to move the needle. Certainly it's not going to compete with the Chinese and what they've done in the past, but I wonder if it's going to have a meaningful impact on these countries to really change the trajectory of these countries the way that PGII purports itself to do.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. On the one hand, I can see it, if it's well targeted, it could have an impact. On the other hand, it's also happening within the larger context of this kind of endless kind of psychodrama of development, that we're living through in our times, in which a country like South Africa with its, where it's the fact that South Africa's rail infrastructure, which is very much not high-speed rail, the fact that even that kind of slow rail is now falling apart into such a spectacular level is having a kind of a knock-on effect that's really kind of dragging down not only South Africa's kind of economic growth, but African the entire kind of sub-Saharan subcontinent, development with it. So infrastructure is important. That doesn't go away. But whether building infrastructure automatically kickstarts development is a whole other question.
Yeah. One of the projects on the PGII list was to do a feasibility study for the United States to invest $250 million in something called the Lobito Corridor. Now, for those of you who subscribe to our site, we've been talking about the Lobito Corridor for quite some time. This may sound new to a lot of you, but it's really, really interesting. And this speaks a little bit to what Cobus was talking about in terms of South Africa's rail infrastructure falling apart. Because the South African rail infrastructure is where the bulk of the raw materials in Southern Africa make their way to the Johannesburg-Pretoria kind of metro hub and then down the railway or on Highway 1 all the way to the Port of Durban. And a lot of that then gets sent to China. Well, that's falling apart. And I think last week, one of the other Transnet railways only operated 36 hours out of 6 days because the rails were falling apart. So these alternate corridors, like the one in Angola called the Lobito Corridor, are becoming increasingly important. So, well, let's see. But this is one of those things to keep an eye on. And as we see all of these kind of dynamics playing out, I really urge everybody to focus what's going on here in Southeast Asia, because in many ways the politics are far more advanced here than in any other part of the world. And in terms of the great power rivalries, in terms of railways, and it's one of the areas, by the way, where the Chinese are continuing to spend. So while the Belt and Road Initiative spending and loans in the Americas, in Africa, in other parts of the world has basically just stopped altogether. We saw last week at the C+C5 summit in Xi'an, that's the China plus the 5 Central Asian countries, where Xi Jinping laid out a very ambitious infrastructure spending agenda to bind Central Asia into China. We see that also with the Laos Railway. The Thai high-speed railway is moving forward. And there's this master plan that is still active to really integrate Southeast Asia all the way down to Singapore with China by rail. So the idea is that I can go from here in Saigon all the way up to Shanghai by rail. And that would be pretty cool. Even the Vietnamese, who have a lot of suspicions about working closely with the Chinese, are excited about that. So that's a really interesting dynamic, whereas all the other parts of the world, the BRI spending has dried up considerably. Southeast Asia and Central Asia and the border states is somewhere where we're not seeing that. Last point, Cobus, it's interesting because this year, one of the things that I've been noticing in our daily coverage is Qin Gang's focus. He's the foreign minister. It seems to me, in my reading of it, that they are focusing a disproportionate amount of attention on border state diplomacy. Mongolia, Myanmar, Vietnam, the Central Asian states, that's where a lot of his attention. Normally, by this time in the year, the Chinese foreign minister has been back to Africa at least once. But Qin Gang has never come back after his annual visit. And it doesn't seem like it's a big priority. There are a lot of foreign ministers from Africa coming to Beijing. So we have the Congolese there now. Also, by the way, the Ethiopian foreign minister is in Beijing this week as well. That's something interesting we should talk about in an upcoming show as well. But it does seem like Chinese priorities have shifted now to focus more on the great power politics and regional diplomacy more than Africa and some of those places further afield.
It seems to me that this might be folded into or dovetailing with their general kind of security obsession at the moment in China. You know, kind of everything, obviously national security has been elevated under Xi Jinping to be at the same level of as economic development, you know, in importance, as the same level of priority as economic development. And the two are increasingly, you know, kind of economic security, power security, trade security, and so on, are all increasingly being folded into national security. So I wonder if this very close focus on the kind of frontiers of China, and this kind of ring of countries, you know, that at its immediate neighborhood, you know, if setting up these kind of logistical and trade corridors with them, making sure that the trade with these countries and with the kind of sub-regions that they represent is kind of bulletproof, you know, that is part of Xi Jinping's kind of security thinking. And I wouldn't be surprised if the kind of diplomacy is then kind of wielded in that direction.
So the idea, what you're saying, is to sanction-proof China's major trade routes.
Yes.
Yeah, interesting.
And, you know, kind of that combined with the fact that they're also building all of these rail connections to bypass traditional shipping choke points as well.
Yeah. Well, we're looking for a guest to join us to talk about Central Asia. And I'm really keen to do that because we're overdue. We've talked about it last year, but not recently, and there's a lot going on there. Listen, very quickly before we go, I want to welcome everybody who is an employee of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. You now have full access to the China Global South project, and you can sign up for our newsletters weekly and daily. So just go to, if you're on the network, anywhere in the IMF and World Bank network, you can access for free all the work that we're doing, the great work that Antonia is doing, Giraud is doing, Johnny in the Middle East is doing, and of course, Cobus as well. And also Han Zhen, our China editor. So we have a fantastic team of editors throughout the Global South who are doing this amazing work every day. Welcome, IMF and World Bank employees. I know a lot of you listen to the show, so I want to help get the word out that you guys can access everything that we're doing for free. If you don't happen to work at the IMF and the World Bank, unfortunately for you and all the wonderful benefits, they have the best cafeteria, by the way, in Washington, Cobus. Really? I love the cafeteria there. And it's just this beautiful atrium that they have in their building. So your tax money at work, by the way. So if you don't work for them and you'd like to follow what we're doing, we would love for you to give us a try. ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. We'll give you a 30-day free trial. We also have student discounts for teachers as well. Just email me, Eric at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I'll send you the links. All those links and all those notes are on our website. Once again, ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. So that'll do it for this edition of the show. Cobus and I will be back again very soon with another episode of the China Global South podcast. Of course, if you want to listen to our Africa feed, you can subscribe to that also on Spotify, on iTunes, and everywhere you get your podcasts. That one comes out on Fridays, and so we have 2 shows a week. So until next time, I'm Eric Olander in Saigon, for Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, and Antonia in Jakarta. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.